Okay, everybody, welcome to the December PDH presentation for the Atlanta Metro Chapter of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers, of course, a state affiliate of the National Society of Professional Engineers. If you're not already a member and you are an engineer, it would probably be a wise decision for you to go ahead and join all three of the organizations and let us help you and to help yourself and everyone in the engineering community. Also, a quick note on the YouTube channel. If you're not already subscribed and haven't already clicked that notification icon, that would be a good thing for you to do as well. That way you get notified as soon as the scheduling comes out for the subsequent events or when anything new is posted. Some quick housekeeping. Our presenter tonight has said that he enjoys the interactivity, so feel free during the course of the presentation to type in any questions you may have in the comment box. I already see some greetings coming through from some folks live on YouTube, but feel free to ask any questions you have that way via text, and I will relay those to our speaker tonight, and then he will, of course, answer for you. So beyond that, I'd like to introduce Jesus Sandoval, the Atlanta Metro Chapter President for GSPE, with a couple of brief announcements in the introduction. Go ahead, Jesus.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Gary Beckstedt. His presentation today is going to be on counterfeit parts and materials, recognizing the threats, mitigating the risks. Gary is a Director of Operations and Quality at Flip Electronics, and I'll let him tell a little bit more about his background. Before we get started this evening, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. One of them has to do with one of our major events here at the Atlanta Metro Chapter, and it is the Math Counts competition. If you haven't already heard about Math Counts, it is an event where 7th, 8th, and middle school grade kids compete in mathematics, math problems. This year's event, or rather next year's event, is going to be virtual, but we're looking for volunteers, and a lot of them. The commitment this year will be a little bit different than it's been in the past. It's going to be virtual, and instead of doing it over the weekend, we're going to be doing it during the week. So you don't have to commute anywhere. You can work from the comfort of your living room. And so if you are interested, I encourage you, please get in touch with us. You can visit the gspe.org website to get additional information. I also want to make an announcement regarding the nominations for several different categories in the Engineer of the Year awards being presented by GSPE. Again, I refer you to the gspe.org website. And finally, I want to encourage you, if you haven't already joined us in the different social media, we're on Meetup, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. Please sign up, subscribe, and also let your colleagues know, and so that we can grow these numbers and serve the community better. That's all I've got, Steve. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation.
All right. Thank you, Jesus. And Gary, it's all yours.
Well, thank you both, Jesus, Steve, and also Roger for having me. I really do appreciate the opportunity. It's an honor, and it's an important element of our continued professional growth to share information with one another across our different disciplines in order to ensure that we're getting the most out of it. So it's a big deal for me to be here. As Jesus mentioned, I am the Director of Operations and Quality here at Flip Electronics. We are an authorized distributor of electronic components in Roswell, Georgia, specifically in end-of-life and obsolete materials. And I promise that's about the end of the commercial. I believe that you all came here to get this information, not to listen to me drone on in a sales pitch. So with that, we'll get moving. My background, I've been in the electronics industry now for about 30 years. Specifically started as a bench tech, working with the Air Force out in Wyoming during Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Got out of the military and began pursuing a career here in Atlanta And then about 12 years ago, I met a gentleman who introduced me into compliance, quality, industrial engineering type of work, and also the reality and the threat of counterfeit electronics. I began studying on the topic and have since been traveling all over the United States and in several places in Asia, teaching and training on this information. So that's really my sweet spot, although I hope tonight that I've broadened the information so that it's useful to folks of a variety of disciplines. As Steve mentioned, I do invite you to ask any questions as I'm going. I don't mind the interruptions. Frankly, I don't like hearing my own voice drone on, so your participation is greatly welcomed. So tonight, my quick agenda, I plan on starting by talking a little bit about the history of counterfeiting. We'll discuss a couple of definitions. I want to give you some examples of counterfeits across a few different industries, as well as talk a little bit about the consequences of counterfeiting and the impact that it's having on our society as a whole. I'll speak briefly about mitigation techniques, things that we can do at the local level as engineering people, and then also at a more corporate level as organizations as a whole. And then, of course, as I mentioned, please don't hesitate to ask questions throughout the presentation. I promise to get everybody out to dinner as quickly as possible, so let's get moving. The history of counterfeiting, personally, I believe that it started as far back as when a guy named Og picked up a rock, hunted some food with it, and another guy named Bog saw Og do that and said to himself, I'm going to copy what he's doing. And there, technically, the first counterfeit began. However, wherever it began, currently the International Chamber of Commerce places the estimated impact of counterfeiting across the global economy at about $991 billion by 2022. To put that into perspective, less than a third of the countries on this planet have a gross domestic product that high. So we're talking a massive impact. To talk about counterfeits, though, I want to define them a little bit because there's a variety of different opinions on what is and is not a counterfeit. On the screen, I've got the definition that comes to us from dictionary.com. But the bottom line is a counterfeit is a counterfeit because it's fraudulently presented. So, for instance, if you're making a shoe and it's a unique shoe and it's branded as your shoe, and somebody else on the street begins making a different shoe but puts your name on it, they're fraudulently presenting that shoe as being yours, and that by definition makes it a counterfeit. On the other hand, if they make a shoe that looks like yours but they don't say it's yours, then that's what's sometimes referred to in the industry as a knockoff. And while there is some argumentation about whether or not knockoffs are fraudulent and therefore counterfeits, for tonight's conversation, I'm going to stick strictly with the idea that the intent to commit fraud is what is the hallmark of defining whether or not something is a counterfeit. Whether it's a product or a process or a thought, anything can be counterfeited. So some examples of these that I wanted to mention. Currency. We're all familiar with counterfeit currency, counterfeit dollars. I've learned recently that there's actually historical evidence for the oldest known currency counterfeits from about 1200 BC. This was during the collapse of the Bronze Age, and the predominant currency at the time was silver, and specifically in the Egyptian kingdoms. So in northern Israel recently, they discovered some silver currency from that time period, but in doing analysis, they discovered it actually wasn't silver, it was copper that was silver plated. Therefore, somebody, 1200 BC, was out there taking copper, wrapping it in silver, claiming it was silver, and passing it off as real silver. There's probably the oldest documented counterfeit that we know. Today, currency counterfeiting is a massive effort. I think most of us are familiar with the recent changes over the past 5 years or so in our own American currency that's being done as anti-counterfeiting techniques. You can also have examples of counterfeits in industrial equipment. For instance, I found a report on some flanges, some plumbing flanges that were received at the Savannah River nuclear site that were supposed to be, by contract, new and unused. However, when the flanges arrived at Savannah River, they found that the bolt holes showed evidence of prior use, the parts were corroded, they were dirty, and since the parts were presented by the supplier as new, and the evidence said otherwise, that's what classified them as counterfeits. We've also seen plenty of evidence of counterfeit clothing, whether it's shoes or bags or pants. They're all over the market. Along those same lines, there's counterfeit safety gear. And this kind of starts getting scary. Where counterfeit clothing is a brand jeopardy, safety gear becomes a health issue. Probably the most common, believe it or not, are counterfeit motorcycle helmets, whether it's because they're made with inferior padding or inferior straps to hold the helmet on. They're frequently rebranded under big names and then resold to people who have no idea. I saw a recent report where they actually took a legitimate motorcycle helmet, set it next to a counterfeit, and asked people which one was the counterfeit, and over 25% of the people picked the legitimate one, which gives you an idea of just how difficult it can be to identify legitimate versus counterfeit parts. And then the one that's near and dear to my heart, electronic components. The counterfeiting industry for electronic components is somewhere in the $6 to $7 billion a year range, and that's just the straight economic impact. It doesn't even begin to touch on things like loss of life, injury, or loss of production. We've seen things in the electronic industry being counterfeited like processors and memory, which kind of makes sense when you look at some of the prices of, say, an Intel chip or some Cypress RAM. But we've also seen counterfeits on things as small as resistors and capacitors, items that may be as inexpensive as a fraction of a penny each, but offshore people are then taking these parts off of circuit boards, reconditioning them, repackaging them, and selling them as new parts, when in fact they're used and old and may have an early failure. So those are just some examples of counterfeits. Some of the consequences, I found several examples. For instance, in December of 2020, just this year, more than 100,000 counterfeit N95 masks were seized by ICE in El Paso. And as I mentioned, they're bound for a local hospital. These masks were inferior in their manufacture. They would allow tremendous amounts of contaminants in and out, jeopardizing the health of the healthcare workers that were wearing them, as well as the patients that they were trying to serve them. Last month in November, there was a white paper by the Automotive Anti-Counterfeiting Council that reported on a raid in China where 163,000 counterfeit airbags were seized. When you put that in perspective, 163,000 airbags that may not go off when needed or may go off when not needed, in either case jeopardizing life and limb of their users. In October, Homeland Security in New Orleans seized 51,000 counterfeit pharmaceuticals worth more than $16.7 million. And these weren't just street drugs. These were typical pharmaceuticals that could be in your cabinet. They included things like healthcare supplements, as well as those magical blue pills, painkillers, and even some antibiotics were discovered in this group. And then another consequence, and this one kind of disturbed me as a military veteran, that according to militarytimes.com, our own government purchased more than $20 million worth of Chinese-made counterfeit clothing goods that were then destined for the battlefield. These goods were designed to be anti-infrared. They were designed to protect our troops from being detected on the field, but the material was inferior and didn't offer the protection that was required. Now, fortunately, in this story, the goods were seized before they ever made it into physical warehouses, and so nobody was actually injured in any way. So these are just some examples of consequences from counterfeiting. The mitigation techniques is where it gets a little interesting for me. There are three basic areas in my mind where we can mitigate counterfeiting. The first is in supply chain control, and this is probably the one that most people are familiar with. In a very simplistic supply chain, you've got a manufacturer who makes the thing, and then a distribution network that sells the thing, and then a using network or an end-use network. Where counterfeiters tend to focus their efforts is in that distribution network. Very, very rarely do you see counterfeit materials coming out of the manufacturers themselves. And typically, if you do, it's a case of a fraudulent manufacturer trying to make additional money. For instance, there was a story I heard of just a few years ago about an organization that was making titanium-coated bolts for the United States military. And the owner of the company figured out that by reducing the amount of plating on the bolt, he could drastically increase his profit margin by over $1 million a year. Unfortunately, these bolts were destined for naval bulkheads and wouldn't stand up under pressure and were caught during receiving testing. This gentleman was convicted and then is going to spend at least the next 12 years in prison for his fraud. But as I mentioned, most counterfeiting is going to come through the distribution network itself. And that's where supply chain control becomes important. By understanding your supply chain, by understanding the role that your suppliers are providing for you, you can figure out and assess what types of risks and risk mitigation techniques can be taken. For instance, in the electronics industry, there are several levels of testing that we can perform based on the type of component to evaluate whether or not the part has been tampered with or if it doesn't contain the proper materials. And then the last thing I want to address is what's referred to as the gray market. And this isn't necessarily a part of everybody's supply chain, but essentially this is folks who are out purchasing materials and then selling them again without the original component manufacturer's authorizations. And in and of themselves, the gray market is not illegal. It doesn't become a problem until they start misrepresenting the material that they're selling. Many of us have bought materials for our automobiles out of the gray market. Aftermarket manufacturers are also considered gray market. But again, where it becomes the challenge is when the aftermarket company is manufacturing the hubcap, putting an original manufacturer's label on it, and selling it off as an original manufacturer product. It may not meet the quality, the specifications, or the safety requirements that the original component had. So how do you control this? As I mentioned, by understanding who your suppliers are. And that falls primarily on our purchasing departments to ensure that they're using reputable suppliers that they've reviewed, that they've looked at their business models, and they keep a constant pulse on the quality of the product that their suppliers are providing. On the flip side, there are engineering efforts that can be made in order to mitigate counterfeits in our supply chain. And the first that I'd like to talk about is what is referred to as design for obsolescence. In my time in the electronics industry, the turnaround or the lifespan on electronics is generally pretty short. Just think about how quickly you'll replace a phone in your pocket and the components that go in it. Increasingly, we're seeing electronic component manufacturers who are designing obsolescence into their product families in order to ensure that they're maximizing their profits. They'll do things like release a new revision of memory chips every 5 to 7 years. In an ideal situation, most of us would prefer to hang on to our $500 cell phone for longer than 3 months. So that effort keeps us going for faster and newer and faster. For those segments in the industry that are maintaining repairs on these things, though, it becomes problematic. One of my favorite examples is the B-52 Stratocaster, the B-52 bomber. The B-52 was introduced into the Air Force in 1955. It is still an active aircraft today, and based on current projections, will continue to fly into 2050. That means when this airframe is finally retired, it will be almost 100 years old. And while they have upgraded a lot of the avionics and a lot of the electronics and even the mechanicals on these aircraft, they're continuing to have to support these things with products that manufacturers are no longer creating. And so as an engineer, as you're designing things, being cognizant of how quickly is this product or this part going to go into obsolescence is an important factor. Once those parts go into obsolescence, you quickly tie your purchasing team's hands on where they can get those parts. And by doing so, force them into gray markets and other unauthorized supply chains in order to get the parts that they're looking for. The other thing I encourage engineering folks to do is make sure that you're cooperating with your purchasing teams and communicating with them. The downside for a lot of purchasing folks is that their pay bonuses are based on how much money they save on a project. So they've got an inherent motivation in order to make sure that they're saving as much money as possible, which can drive them into shady supply chain options. By having engineering and purchasing working closely with one another and having that communication flow, you can, as an engineer, provide to your purchasing teams understanding about what it is they're buying to help them understand the significance of making sure that what they're buying are authentic, legitimate products from a very solid supply chain. And then finally, there's the corporate culture itself. As a whole, your entire organization needs to understand and embrace the challenge of counterfeits. It can't be done at the ground level. There requires tremendous amounts of awareness and training in order to make sure that we understand what's going on. You also have to, as a company, learn to prioritize quality over cost savings. Every time I bring that up to a C-level audience, there's groans. Everybody wants to save money and everybody wants to maximize profits. That's how we all get paid in the end. But there's a trade-off there, an opportunity cost. By compromising on the quality of what we're building and what we're buying and what we're providing, we can oftentimes do more damage to our reputation and to the public and our customers as a whole than by just charging a bit more for authentic material. And again, this is a top-down paradigm. If your leadership team isn't buying into it, there isn't a motivation downhill to make sure that these mitigation efforts are being put in place. I am constantly stressing to organizations, and even within our own, the importance of making sure that as leaders we lead by that example, that talking about supply chain control and design for obsolescence and supplier management is a forefront in our minds, in addition to making sure that our customers are satisfied. That is the sum up. Since no one has asked any questions, I went way too fast, but I appreciate your time, and I invite any questions, please, at this time.
Oh, come on, guys. Somebody's got to have some questions now. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's chat. Hopefully somebody will ask some questions. I'll just comment, though, Gary, that as someone in the C-suite myself, I can tell you I happen to agree with your take on that, and it is because of the reputation of the company. It's just not worth it from my way of looking at it to not pay attention to the quality, like you say, for just a tiny bit more money, especially if it's a product that somebody's life depends on it. Just think of all the money that you'll lose in lawsuits as well as reputation. So, okay, we have somebody, let's see, I guess this is a comment more, but here, let's put this in here for you. From Jeff, says, when I worked at Oak Ridge National Lab, we had a fastener specification with prohibited bolt markings to keep counterfeits out of the nuclear environment.
I have worked with and spoken to several people in the nuclear industry, and my hats are off to you. Just the sheer engineering effort and the intelligence that goes into creating and managing a nuclear environment is beyond measure. But the efforts in that industry as a whole to control counterfeits has been monumental, especially in the mechanical range. You know, I can't imagine the nightmare of having a water cooling pipe burst because the walls are too thin. And in the electronic side, I've seen it pretty dramatically rise up as far as the mitigation efforts, simply because one of the biggest threats facing my industry now are counterfeits that we can't physically detect. Things like embedded code inside of field programmable gate arrays that will transmit information to nefarious users about what's going on with that system. I heard a story, and I have to admit this is possibly urban legend, but I heard it from a very good source, that even the Navy ran into a situation with one of their nuclear subs where a circuit board that was used for position determining had one of these chips in it that are referred to as Trojan horses, and it was designed that every time the chip sensed that the sub had surfaced, it would then transmit the location that the boat had been throughout the time, thereby giving away to our enemies the patterns of our nuclear fleet. So thank you for sharing that comment. Absolutely. There's a lot of efforts, and that's one of the good ones.
Yeah, we have a couple more coming in here, so that's good. We did that. Let's see. So Jesus is asking, to what extent is the electronics industry leveraging the blockchain?
In my opinion, not enough. The challenge is there isn't a really standardized way to leverage blockchain in counterfeit mitigations for electronics. Part of the challenge is determining how to flow that down throughout the entire distribution chain. I mentioned earlier the gray market isn't illegal. It's certainly not first preference, but component manufacturers recognize that it is a very legitimate and needed part of our industry. So being able to create blockchain sequences is okay in your authorized distribution chains where you can then pass along the technology for decoding and ensuring, but it's when it gets into the gray market that it becomes problematic. We are efforting that. One of the other great initiatives in the electronics industry for counterfeit mitigation is the idea of using DNA sequencing, actually putting DNA sequence on individual chips that then can then be read and traced back to a database at the manufacturer to confirm that these parts were legitimately made by that manufacturer.
Good. By the way, excuse me, one other comment I was going to make too, and we've got a couple more coming in the electronics industry, which is where I work. We've actually seen some interesting, you were talking about some of those very inexpensive parts like resistors and capacitors and things, not only used, but we've seen some cases in the past where the counterfeit parts are new, but they're actually not to the same tolerances. So the specifications are not met because it's typically a Chinese manufacturer that's made something out of spec. Maybe it's really a 20% tolerance, but we've spec'd a 5% tolerance or a 2% tolerance, and they sell it as a 2 or a 5% when it's really 20. And it adversely impacts the performance of the product as well. And those, I can tell you from personal experience, can be an absolute nightmare to try and track down because they're very hard to figure out where the bad component is in that sort of situation.
It's amazing how a 3-cent handful of capacitors can destroy a $10,000 circuit board in a heartbeat. Put them in your power network or put them in a power conditioning circuit, and you've got a big problem.
Absolutely.
One of the earliest counterfeits I ever saw on my own was a technique referred to as blacktopping, where you take a plastic encapsulated part, the counterfeiters will grind the marking off of the top of the part, put a new layer of plastic on top of it, and then mark it whatever they want. And in this case, what they did was they bought a bunch of commercial graded parts that were certified for 0 to 85 degrees Celsius use, and they remarked them as industrial, so they were rated for minus 40 to 125 Celsius, and sold at 5 times the cost. Now, because of the training and the equipment that we had, we were able to detect these and pull them out of the supply chain. But it really was mind-boggling to think that people were willing to do that, not even thinking through the consequences down the road of what this is going to do to someone.
Absolutely. Yep. All right, let's see. Jeff asks, how would you recommend tying buyer performance rewards to proper testing of critical parts?
Buyer performance rewards to testing. If I understand what you're saying, it sounds like maybe you're wondering how we can move buyers away from the purchase price variance model for bonuses and more towards the actual performance level.
That's my take anyway.
I think the key to that's going to be, again, what I alluded to earlier about making sure that purchasing and engineering are in tight communications and then able to communicate that to senior management. When you've got a component that is end of life, maybe it's an FPGA or maybe it's a processor, if the purchasing team has the ability and the liberty within your organization to go to engineering and say, here's the situation, and then the conversation begins on whether or not we should respin this board or pay the extra PPV to keep it alive. Removing the motivation for the buyer to buy inferior products to avoid the respin, but rather help using them to identify any potential crosses or to reward them for being the person who's got their finger on the pulse of the supply chain strong enough to say, this is what we're finding, these are threats we need to deal with and get them handled.
We do have a couple more, but something that I thought of that maybe you can talk about a little bit too is you talk about how your company specifically deals in end-of-life parts. Maybe you can tell folks some of the things that you guys do to ensure that the parts you're getting are as they should be and not counterfeit, not old, not degrading, that sort of thing.
Okay, I appreciate it, Steve. I know my marketing manager would love to hear this conversation. Flip began 5 years ago by a group of us who have been in distribution for many, many years and decided to attack a different niche, and that is specifically the end-of-life obsolescence. The approach we've got that's different is we're forging and maintaining relationships with original component manufacturers to buy up their aged stock that they've got on the shelf and stock it for them. So, for instance, you take a memory manufacturer like Cypress. When they produce a new family or a new generation of a memory chip, they go to their mainline distributors and say, we don't want you selling the old one anymore, we want you to sell the new one. However, that leaves tens or even hundreds of thousands of units sitting on the shelf at Cypress that nobody is marketing anymore. From a financial perspective, they then write that off and it just sits there and gathers dust. Well, meanwhile, end users who need those chips have no way of knowing that they're actually out there. So what Flip does is we go to these manufacturers and negotiate with them in order to buy that stock from them and have it here in our facility where we maintain it and manage it. And then we're able to provide to the end user authentic manufacturer parts with traceability and documentation back to the manufacturer of parts that they can't get anywhere else in the market. They may be able to find them in the gray market, but oftentimes those are parts that perhaps another OEM had as excess, sold to an independent distributor, and then that independent distributor is selling them out, and there's no traceability. And traceability, for any of you that are in the government segment know, is key. In order to prove that these parts are in fact legitimate through the documentation that shows the chain of custody, then you're able to say with certainty these are good parts. And that's where Flip really has made our niche. We've partnered with, I believe it's about 12 or 14 manufacturers at this point, and we're continuing to grow every year in that very segment. You're muted, Steve.
Sorry about that. I'll just add on the traceability front, something we're finding even in the commercial non-government arena, especially in international arenas with a lot of the EU requirements. Traceability is very important as well for things like RoHS and WE and just other various government entities that require certain things for traceability, for conflict minerals, whatever it happens to be, as well as quality. So we've been audited for that sort of thing at my company because we're in over 120 different countries, and believe me, we've had some pretty tough audits on that particular front. So it's good that you guys are doing that sort of thing. It's a huge help to companies like us.
And if I could put on my prognition hat for a moment, I think that the days of traceability through documentation may be going away here shortly because, as I'd like to point out, if you think it's hard to counterfeit an electronic component, think about how easy it is to counterfeit a document.
Yes.
But until we can get to that technology, for instance, the blockchain or the DNA testing, to be able to standardize that across the industry, that documentation is going to be the answer.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Bob has asked, how do you characterize the process of manufacturers of PC motherboards who sell all the ones they make but charge more for the ones that make it longer in the burn-in process? That's an interesting question. So basically burn them in a little longer and they charge you more for the same thing.
Well, I have to admit I'm not familiar with that practice, but to me it sounds, I would say, maybe less ethical.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one either. That's news to me.
I guess I could see the argument perhaps being made that through the longer burn-in process, they're demonstrating that the board has a higher survivability rate. But strictly from an electronics theory perspective, the longer that board's in burn-in, the less lifespan it has. So I'm not quite sure how they would get that one.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's news to me. Let's see. So back before there was some conversation about blockchain or a question about blockchain. So Roger's asking to please explain the function of the blockchain, at least in this particular environment, I guess, if not in general.
I have to say the phrase my wife hates to hear me say, and that is, I don't know enough about this topic to really give you a good solid answer. My understanding is that blockchain is related to using software encoding in order to establish provenance on parts and ideas. I know of it mostly through cryptocurrency and through software ensuring. I've heard rumblings in the electronics component industry of exploring ways to use it, but I haven't seen any even proof of concepts of it being used at this point. So, unfortunately, Roger, I can't give you a good answer on that one.
Yeah, I might be able to add a little bit to that. I think provenance is the key, and like you were talking before, Gary, about the documentation aspects. Blockchain, given that once you've established the initial entry and confirmed that initial entry, because it's a massively distributed ledger, it makes it exceedingly difficult to actually basically produce a fraudulent record, because far too many people have copies of that record. So if somebody tries to forge a record, they'll basically get caught very easily. So that would be something to address your documentation. If you could go to blockchain-based electronic documentation to confirm the provenance, it's something that would make it extremely difficult to forge the paperwork, so to speak. And there may be other ways as well, but that's what I know of anyway.
Oh, and that lines up with something I've heard about with at least 2 manufacturers right now that are experimenting with going to paperless CFCs, or certificate of conformances, where that would actually work out. But again, it would require a tremendous amount of standardization.
Yes.
And the electronics industry is not known for playing nicely with one another. In fact, we have standards upon standards upon standards just to standardize sizes of components, let alone how they behave. Here at Flip, when I'm training, one of the things I teach people is rule number 1 is that the manufacturers make the rules and they change them anytime they want to. So,
yeah, not gonna argue that point. Let's see here. Richard says, have ran into boards that have been exposed to chlorine. Wow. And were supposed to be destroyed, but were sold as aftermarket. That's kind of interesting.
That's not terribly surprising. I was requesting permission from another organization in my industry and couldn't secure the permission. But a gentleman I know went to China and actually took photographs, quite honestly at risk to his own life for doing this, of some of these reprocessing plants. Until just a few years ago, China was the dominant recipient in the world of United States electronic waste. And what a huge amount of it would end up in are in these tiny villages where they would scrape the parts off of boards and repackage them and resell them. And in some cases, some of the photos he had showed mounds 2 and 3 feet high of used processor chips. And they were reflowing the solder on these things over 5-gallon buckets of heated coals. And then they would send them off to get the leads restraightened and retinned. And then entire markets in Shenzhen, China that just look like food markets, only they're just electronics. And you could walk up to a booth and say, I want this date code and I want this specification. They would mark it for you right there, put it on tape and reel or in trays, and off you go.
Wow, that's scary.
Yeah. A lot of changes in the global market have made that harder and harder for them to do, not the least of which are our efforts to control and better regulate how we recycle our electronics and our electronic waste.
Wow. All right, let's see. RW says, I've been in quality control and engineering. In construction, quality is a field process at the construction site. And then there's a question, do you see others that have quality control relying heavily on final assembly?
Not successfully. One of the hallmarks of a true quality mindset is that you can't build quality into your product. Quality has to be from the very beginning. And it is all about your process controls. if your quality is implemented at the inspection stage, when after the fact we're trying to figure out if we did it right, it's way too late. And then it's not a matter of if something's going to fail, it's simply a matter of when. So no, I can't say that I've seen anybody successfully going at that route.
Yeah, I can tell you in our manufacturing process, because we control it all, we have 100% traceability for absolutely everything from printing the boards all the way through to final assembly. Mm-hmm. And it's 100% tested in our case. So, let's see. Jeff, again, is saying PC overclockers know about the burn-in question. They know some chips can handle higher speeds but aren't certified to do so. Because they've not been through the same burn-in testing. Okay.
Okay. That sounds similar to a standard practice in the memory manufacturing segment, where they will build a lot of a specific part and then do their speed testing to determine what speed range these things are going to work at. And in some cases, you can buy parts that are rated for a lower speed that will actually perform in a higher speed bracket, but the demand was for the lower speed, so that's what the manufacturers marked them as.
Yeah. Boy, as I recall, I think it was the 486, the Intel 486, the DX versus SX. Mm-hmm. I think that was something they did on their own, was they ran it through testing. When they probed the wafers, they would actually check the specs, and if it met full spec, it was a DX, and if it didn't fully meet the specs, then it was an SX. So you got something in between. It was assured to be at least as good as an SX specs, but it might have been almost as good as a DX. You just never knew what you were going to get in that case.
Wow, I haven't thought about 486s in a couple of decades, Steve. Thanks there.
Yeah, I didn't think about it either until this one came up. The memories. Let's see. Jeff has another one. He says, do you have any personal observations about manufacturers adding trojans to their products to catch counterfeiters? Example, Google Maps adding fake streets. Interesting.
Personal observations, no. I have to believe that is going on. I think that my lack of personal knowledge of it is tied to the fact that if I were doing it, I wouldn't let it out in public knowledge either. As an authorized distributor for several lines of component manufacturers, I will tell you that they don't let us very far behind the curtain to know exactly what all they're doing. So again, I would be surprised if that's not happening, especially in the processor, FPGA, the higher IC market. I have to think that it's going on somewhere in there.
Yeah. All right. I've got your contact information up there again real quick. Anybody else? Let's see. Here we go. Somebody else is coming in. Tom says, isn't that what Celeron processors are about too? I heard that years ago, maybe a myth. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I can't answer that one for you for sure. In our world of component verification, where data sheets rule, Intel, Broadcom are notorious for not giving out technical information about their products that are outside the scope of a sales brochure. So that wouldn't surprise me.
Yep. All right. Anybody else? Let's see. Give them just a few more seconds here, see if they can rack their brains and come up with some other good questions. I think this has been good dialogue at the end here, so
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to get in touch with me over email, it's very simple. It's just Gary@flipelectronics.com, and I'll be glad to engage any other conversations or questions. And some of these questions would be easier if I had time to Google them and look them up myself and dig them out for you.
Yeah. So I'm curious, do you guys warehouse all your parts there at your offices, or do you have an off-site facility or multiple facilities? How do you work that?
All of our components are stored in Shenzhen, China. No, I'm kidding. Yes, everything's right here in Roswell, Georgia. We have got a fairly sizable warehouse. We're actually outgrowing it and moving within the next year. We do believe in having positive control over the materials. It's in our segment of the industry, reputation is everything, and I'm not willing to risk it by having the materials somewhere else.
Sure.
And it's a good sign of dealing with an independent distributor when they don't have the stock immediately available. The only time that I run into that situation is when I'm waiting for the manufacturer to finish making the parts before I can ship them. And with COVID, that has become a bigger and bigger problem. But I know just a few months ago, there was a good video here on the supply chain impact of COVID. So that was a good watch to make the plug. If anybody hasn't gone back on the YouTube channel, watch that one.
Thank you. Yeah. That's something I think a lot of us have been hit with on the supply chain side, and interestingly enough, it's also had an impact on the customer side, as everyone might imagine. Certain things have slowed down.
It's been one of the biggest boons for the counterfeit industry.
Yeah,
Absolutely has.
Yep. So, all right. I'm not seeing anything else, but Gary, I would like to thank you very much on behalf of the Atlanta Metro chapter of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers and everyone online. We have 27 people online right now, so pretty decent attendance. So, and remember, everybody, tell your friends about this as well, because this will be out there on YouTube. Pretty much forever, at least as long as Google keeps YouTube around. So tell a friend, tell a colleague, and let them know that they missed a great presentation, and come watch it after the fact.
Great. Thank you very much again for having me. It was a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you all.
All right. Thanks, Gary. And hope everybody has a great evening and happy holidays, since we won't see everybody again until January. So thank you, everyone.